tried showing what happened, what's going on with the Chinese economy, they're now seeing themselves targeted by the CCP. And all these incidents are raising growing questions over the stability of the Chinese economy and, frankly, what it could mean for the world. Now, first, let's have a look at the vanishing Chinese banks. The Economist said this. They said the savings and loan crisis terrorized American banks for years, starting in the mid-1980s, a mix of aggressive lending, growth, poor risk controls, and a property downturn contributed to the collapse or consolidation of over 1,000 small lending institutions. And they note that China's smallest banks are now suffering from many of the same ailments. But until recently, few have collapsed or merged with others. And that is starting to change, they said. They said in the week ending June 24th, 40 Chinese banks vanished as they were absorbed into bigger ones. Not even at the height of the S&L crisis, the one in the 80s in the US, did lenders disappear at such a clip. And as China's regulators have been trudging through various reforms and consolidations for years, and that since 2019, several mid-tier banks have collapsed. They note that powerful investment managers and state financiers have melted down, but it is small rural banks that provide the most complex problem. Why is that? Well, they say that some 3,800 such institutions dot the Chinese countryside, and they have about 55 trillion yuan in assets, 13% of the total banking system in China, and have long been mismanaged, accruing vast amounts of bad loans. Many have lent to real estate developers, which, that's going around in China, and to local governments, which are also feeling the brunt of some of this. It notes that gaining exposure to the Chinese property crisis now unfolding. And in recent years, some have revealed that 40% of their books are made up of non-performing loans. Cleaning up this mess is an extremely delicate task, it says. Many banks were established in order to serve small businesses, especially in China's poorest areas. And those stuck with toxic debts, it says, struggle to supply firms with new loans, which can hurt vulnerable companies and local economic growth. The worst performing small banks have already threatened social stability, the main concern of Xi Jinping, China's leader. Now, it notes that fraud on a large scale caused several to freeze withdrawals in 2022, which drew depositors onto the streets of a provincial capital. You might remember people wanted their money. They were demanding it. They protested. The CCP arrested them. I'll get into that in a bit. But it notes further in that state intervention is risky. Rumors of distress, restructuring, or consolidation can lead to bank runs. Already happening, by the way. Now look, on the bad loans in particular, this has been a growing bubble for a long time in China. And one of the main methods that the CCP was using to prop up its economy was mega projects, the ghost cities. You might remember those, right? The giant cities they're building in China that nobody lives in. Empty buildings, empty skyscrapers, the whole 9 yards. The highways and the trains that go to nowhere. They build, for example, like superhighways that just lead to basically nowhere, places nobody lives. They build airports in these areas that nobody uses. And there's a reason for this. These massive infrastructure projects were the way the CCP was using essentially to try to pump money into the Chinese economy. And the idea is pretty simple, right? They say that, well, you take bank money, you give loans out, you pay developers and others for the projects, the companies doing the constructions, the businesses that move in and basically build the whole thing. Those people then go on to hypothetically spend that money. And when they spend the money, well, what happens? The money flows through the economy and the country gets more wealthy. At least that's what they thought. The CCP had some real problems with this. One problem is that, well, a lot of Chinese people, other than the super wealthy, a lot of them have lived through various CCP social revolutions, purges, the Cultural Revolution. A lot of them have seen what it's like when things go bad. And so they don't want to spend their money. They sit on their money. They don't make it flow within the economy like the CCP wanted. They put it in the bank. And sometimes the ones who have a lot of it don't dare put it in the bank. Because another problem is that people who had a lot of money and knew how the system worked, They knew the corruption. They knew the games and the funny numbers and so on. Well, they tended to not want to keep their money in Chinese assets. They don't want yuan. They don't want Chinese currency. So what do? Well, they put the money into things like foreign real estate. This is one of the reasons why you have Chinese people, or they're oftentimes the children of wealthy elites, coming to the US or Canada or other countries, and they buy up real estate. They buy diamonds or US dollars even. They just, convert their money because they don't want to keep the money in China. They don't see it as stable for their futures. And so a big chunk of that plan to get, money flowing internally within the Chinese economy, it didn't work. And notably, that's one of the reasons the CCP even rolled out the digital yuan, because they don't want capital outflow. They don't want money leaving the Chinese economy. But there's also other issues, corruption, for example. And when the CCP delegates money for a mega project, the way it often happens is this. Every single person at every single step of that, all the way down to the developers at the bottom, they all take a bit of cream off the top. They take a bit of money off the top, right? One for the patient, one for the doctor. And as the money flows downward, well, oftentimes there's not even enough for the mega projects. This is why you have what they call tofu buildings. Buildings where you can take your finger and stick it through a wall, or, just swipe away at a beam holding up a big skyscraper. It's because of this, the corruption. They took money away from the projects to the extent that the projects themselves, well, nobody wants to live in them. They're not stable. But there's also other things. Probably the biggest problem of them all, in fact, the problems of the banks and the loans themselves. Because look, normally it's maybe a good plan, depending on how you do it. If you, for example, finance the construction of houses or a big housing project, in the US, for example, well, typically they sell. You'd expect people to buy them. At the very least, the banks buy them, or investment firms, because they want the assets. But what happens if people do not buy them? Well, what happens then is that you spend a whole bunch of money on it and you have the debt, but there's nothing to pay back that debt because you did not make money off the project. And because of that, of course, what has happened is that debt has built up over these bank loans that have been used to build these projects. Oftentimes it's the local governments that, for example, take out the loans to do these mega projects. And because of this, the banks themselves have just been taking it on the chin. And it's this crisis that's now causing the market to reach the furthest limits of this bubble, this housing bubble that's already bursting, right? The housing bubble is burst, the manufacturing bubble is bursting, and as these are bursting, the banks are the next domino in that line. Now add to this the other problems, again, of the housing market crashing, the CCP getting embroiled in trade wars, the aging population, younger people just kind of checking out of the workforce. They don't want to be part of the game anymore. Well, take all this into account, and you're looking at the Chinese economy itself being pushed to the brink, right alongside a banking crisis that even by itself could level an economy. But with the Chinese crisis happening right now with the banking system, it seems the banks and everything else with all this, right? The dominoes in that whole line, the banks right now are taking the brunt of it. They're taking it the hardest. Now, remember we talked before about how China was facing possible economic collapse. And those of you who've been watching Crossroads for a while know that I was talking about this before COVID. At the time, 2019 era roughly, at that time there was also a US-China trade war. The CCP's economy was also crumbling. And what was happening because of that? It was causing mass protests. There was social unrest. There was the protests in Hong Kong, for example. You had people on the streets of China wanting change. The CCP cracked down on them. Hong Kong lost its freedom, and then COVID hit. And when the world locked down for COVID, notably on the recommendations of the China model, which the WHO was taking as the model for the world, and
Joe Biden took it.
The lockdowns happened. The Chinese Communist Party then came out after the whole world locked down their economies, and the CCP declared that they fixed everything and they were building back. And because they were building back, they declared that then was the time for foreign investors to start pouring money back into the Chinese economy because, hey, you're going to make money through the process. Well, it didn't really happen that way. The big problem they had is, of course, well, they didn't really change anything, and they kept locking down. And then other issues started up, and the economy started going south. But the big problem now is we see the return of these problems, which never really went away. You know, aside from the rest of the world probably not wanting to shut down their economies again, which the CCP would probably try to use, this particular crisis, the return of the 2019 impact, the one that's been deferred a bit because of foreign investment, this is now impacting the banks and the investors themselves. In other words, the CCP doesn't have a way out of it like they did last time. Nikkei Asia notes, multiple Chinese listed companies have warned investors of a potential fallout from the latest move by the liquidator of Jiangsu Enterprise Group. That's a bankrupt wealth manager and shadow bank caught up in the country's property crisis. It notes in an official report statement last Friday, Beijing Dacheng Law Offices, the liquidator of the case appointed by the court through an open bidding process, applied to consolidate Jiangsu and 247 related companies as a single entity in pursuing the ongoing bankruptcy process. The court documents include Dacheng's description of the Jiangxi Group companies as having a complicated, connected party relationship with, quote, widespread asset distribution, enormous liabilities, and their corporate personalities being highly confusing. And notes that by Monday evening, nearly 10 listed companies had expressed concern over how the move could affect the equity stakes some of the affected entities hold in them. In other words, again, this is going to impact investors. Now, look, on the surface, the problems look pretty serious. Even for the CCP to allow information on an economic crisis like this, to let it get out, to let the whole world see it, that is rare, especially when it's making foreign investors wary of putting their money back into China. This goes against the interests of the party. And so why are they doing it? Well, I'll be talking about how the CCP's own censorship is suggesting that the economic problem in China could actually be even worse than what they're saying. All this, though, after we come back from a short break. And a dozen other victims of China's biggest banking scandals had gathered outside a train station in Henan's provincial capital, and they said this: Henan banks, return our savings. They shouted that. Footage of the protests obtained by Reuters showed this, in fact. And it notes this: dressed in winter coats, the group wandered about the street for about 30 minutes until one of several unidentified men who had been tailing them shouted, "Close the net." And the protesters were pushed onto a bus and delivered to a police station, according, it says, to two people with direct knowledge of the matter. And it said most were released after several days in detention, during which they were served moldy food and had limited sleep. But this individual and two others, defrauded depositors, right, these people who were defrauded by this, are still being held by Zhengzhou police, the two people said. Now, it doesn't end with that, in fact. There's also the auditing firms. Now, you know, normally, if there are companies publicly traded on the stock exchange, well, you know, they can be audited. Investors need to be sure the numbers are real. They need to make sure they're not getting pulled into a Ponzi scheme or something. You need to make sure that if a business says it's making a certain amount of money, that they're telling the truth. And that's the way the stock market works normally. There needs to be some accountability. But in China, the Chinese Communist Party outright blocks audits of many companies, even some in the U.S. stock exchange, for example. Now, you can take what was said last year about some of the problems in China. Reuters noted in May of 2023 this. They said the U.S. Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, PCAOB, found unacceptable deficiencies in audits of U.S.-listed companies performed by KPMG in China and PricewaterhouseCoopers in Hong Kong. The government agency said on Wednesday at the time, again last year. And it's the U.S. Audit Watchdog published the findings of its inspection after gaining access to Chinese company auditors' records for the first time last year, following more than a decade of negotiations with Chinese authorities. It took them, more than 10 years or around that to be able to properly audit these companies, and even that's based on what they were given. And it notes the deficiencies were so great that auditors failed to obtain sufficient evidence to substantiate companies' financial statements. It notes that PCAOB Chair Erica Williams told reporters this on Wednesday again last year. And notes that two firms represented 40% of the market share of U.S.-listed companies audited by Hong Kong and mainland China firms, she said. In other words, it's a black box. The CCP prevents proper oversight. They prevent audits. You can't actually figure out if they're even real or not, if they're making the money they claim they're making. Many people would claim it's a Ponzi scheme with some of these companies. But since then, things have actually gotten worse. The Chinese Communist Party now, they've enacted new rules that make it a crime if you even criticize the Chinese economy. New York Times said that China's top intelligence agency issued an ominous warning last month about an emerging threat to the country's national security: Chinese people who criticize the economy. They note that in a series of posts on its official WeChat account, the Ministry of State Security, kind of the CCP's equivalent of like the CIA and FBI, it says they implored citizens to grasp President Xi Jinping's economic vision and not be swayed by those who sought to, quote, denigrate China's economy through, quote, false narratives. And what happens if you do that? Well, they note that to combat this risk, the ministry said, security agencies will focus on strengthening economic propaganda and public opinion guidance. Meaning they'll tell you what to think. They'll tell you what to say.
What happened in
China
the past
is intensifying its crackdown while struggling to reclaim the dynamism and rapid economic growth of the past. Now, it notes as well,
2022.
Beijing has censored and tried to intimidate renowned economists, financial analysts, investment banks, and social media influencers for bearish assessments of the economy and the government's policies. In other words, if you question it, if you criticize it, if you speak the truth, frankly, the CCP is going after people for this. It notes as well that in addition, news articles about people experiencing financial struggles or the poor living standards for migrant workers are being removed. The Chinese Communist Party is censoring, deleting, threatening anything, any individual, any information that would show the truth of what is happening with the economy right now. Now, part of this is being enforced by the CCP through vague and broad revisions to the communist regime's law on guarding state secrets. Al Jazeera said this in May. They say the changes to the law on the guarding of state secrets enacted on Wednesday at the time come as President Xi Jinping's government steps up the focus on national security, including by updating China's anti-espionage law and increasing the scrutiny of firms with foreign ties. It said this has included police raids on consultancies and arrests of foreign executives on espionage charges. And further, it states that changes brought to the law by China's top legislative body in February broadened the scope to include work secrets, as they call them. Information, it says, that does not amount to state secrets, but could cause, quote, adverse effects if leaked. For example, people don't want to invest in China. It says the revisions also require internet companies to crack down and cooperate with investigations into suspected leaks. Now, it notes that in the event of a suspected state security leak, Article 34 of the revised act, the new one, states that network operators shall, quote, immediately stop its transmission, save relevant records, and report the case to the Secrets Administration departments or public security organs and state security organs, end quote. And it's the operators are also obliged to delete the information if requested. So in other words, the CCP is carrying out a large-scale propaganda and censorship campaign right now focused on the economy. Well, everyone, that's all for tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free.